friends, as part of the series, today we have the poet Stephen Spender, who also belonged to the 1930s as an activist poet, a poet who was called Pink Poet and who was progressive in nature, will be discussed by Professor Richa Bajaj, who teaches English in Hindu College, Delhi University. And she is quite aware about the situation that existed in the 1930s, which was actually a period between the two wars, the First World War and the Second World War, and clouds of the interests or pressures of the earlier period were still hovering over England, if not entirely over the world. So these people were the voices of which Stephen Spender also was a part. And I have to say one or two things before I request Dr. Bajaj to take over. He was known as a gentle soul, as a person who would be most accessible as an editor, as a writer, as a person who would take positions though, and his positions were clearly progressive positions. One I remember, I would be standing corrected if I am wrong, that he was absolutely anti-war. And he in fact wrote poems about the war devastating the world, and he said that unless conditions become amenable to peace and quiet tranquility in the country, in the world, poetry cannot survive. So this kind of position. So there are other things also which we will be discussing, but then I request Dr. Bajaj to take over and give her comments about different things that are connected with Stephen Spender. So over to you, Professor Bajaj.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. So yes, you're right in the sense that Stephen Spender belonged to that group of Pink poets. In fact, these poets were often also called a part of Auden group. At some point, they were, also, of course, they were anti-war poets of the 1930s. But it's interesting to note how there are a group of writers who have turned to literature as an agent or a vehicle of change, or as a medium through which they could express their protest and register their protest against the regimes of the time. And 1930s of course is a problematic era, and he belonged to the Auden group. He was also very influenced by Auden, and when Auden passed away, he in fact wrote a poem on Auden, which was Auden's funeral. So in that sense he belongs to the same tradition of Auden. But having said that, Spender is very different in that sense. He is more lyrical and at the same time intensely personal. He he was born in 1909 in London, and at a very early age during the First World War itself, you can imagine that in a couple of years he'd be faced with the war, and he was still a child, 8 or so, when the family had to relocate, leave London because of the bombardments, etc., and make way for Lake District. And the moment he was in Lake District, and where the family lived for a while, his parents would read out to him works of Wordsworth, and that was the time Spender said in one of his interviews that he decided that he wanted to be a poet. And I think that says a lot about his early influence, the influence of Wordsworth on his poetry. I think that is also the reason why he's very different from Auden, and in his poems he's very passionate and lyrical at the same time, intensely personal, I'd say. Also the sad industrial world of Wordsworth's poetry also takes a new shape in Spender's poetry, where it becomes more cruel and in fact devastating, because by the time he comes to writing in 1930s, it's the interwar period, so you've already seen the effects of the First World War, and you're inexorably moving towards another war in a matter of a decade. So I think Spender is that voice of, it's like a Wordsworthian voice in the 20th century, and self-critical and also deeply aware of the kind of malaise that he's a part of. So I think that kind of sadness, that kind of sad tone that Wordsworth had, when he's talked about the still sad music of humanity, is also available in Spender to some extent, and that I think makes him more personal, lyrical and passionate of a poet.
What exactly do you mean by personal? Because he's a progressive voice and
Right.
he's supposed to represent the mood of the times.
Right.
But when you say personal, I think there's something specific that you want to convey.
Right. I mean the subjective person. You see, Spender was always caught between how best to project the tension between the outer and the inner worlds, and he he tried to bring that out not only in his poetry but in his plays, and also in his autobiography. His autobiography was titled World Within World, and it was published in 1951. It traced the period from 1928 to the 30s. He wanted to bring alive that period, and in a sort of a preface to World Within World, he actually said that it is my I want to chart this journey from Oxford in 1928 to the literary political events of the 1930s. But he was also aware that that autobiography required this very important thing, and I quote, he says that in his preface, he says that a view which tends to become a part of his own himself, he's influenced by the other people, but he notes that the great problem of autobiography remains, which is to create the true tension between these inner and outer, subjective and objective worlds, unquote. So the idea that autobiography also is a mode through which he is constantly juggling between the personal and the political, the subjective and the objective. I think he was trying to strike a chord, trying to understand how best to provide this tension that exists between these inner and outer worlds that constitute his living, because again, he was also influenced by Freud, so he believed in the personal was a very important part of the larger objective world for him. So there are some very direct poems on love, for instance, some very direct poems on himself. So those kind of poems are are personal in that sense, where he's not talking about politics. There is no larger world around. It's a direct form of you and I that he takes and goes on to write about it. But those are the short poems mostly. But when he turns to the objective world, then there are poems where he situates himself at the margins. There he is very impersonal. There he doesn't like to bring in the personal or the I too much into being. He is merely talking about great writers, like for instance in his poem I Think Continually, he goes on to talk about the great works that these writers have done. Who are these writers who carry the soul of the nation? They are these people who have been able to whose lips are on fire, and at the same time they understand the soul's history. So he is talking about these writers who have influenced him, or great writers about whom he has something to say. At such a moment, the I is obliterated.
I like the phrases such as lips on fire,
yeah,
and history of the soul, all these
right
things.
So he talks about the soul's history, and he talks about the springs that flow and the springs that they carry forward. So I think there is a sense of, you can already see a lot of natural imagery there, very Wordsworthian, I'd say again, where he talks about the natural images, and then imagines and is in a trance. In fact he says that poetry is something that is a dream-like thing, and it needs to be written in that moment, in a dream. You cannot, and again, if it's a dream thing, then how is it real? So I think this is the kind of attention that he tried to build when he was talking about the kind of autobiography that he wanted to write. And in fact, on the same note, on World Within a World, he also talked about the task of an autobiographer, and he said, and I quote, that an autobiographer is really writing a story of two lives: his life as it appears to himself from his own position, when he looks out at the world from behind his eye sockets, and his life as it appears from outside in the minds of others, a view which tends to become in part his own view of himself, since he is influenced by the opinions of others.
That's very poetic, and that's very convincing. And in the simplest phrases, he's not using any difficult phrase at all.
Right.
Even though he's talking about mind and something that is that resembles the outside world, and the two mutually react to all those things, and yet he's making a very complex point very simple.
Right. I think what he's also referring to here is the kind of worlds that a poet or a creative person occupies. One is a sense of interiority, the inner world, and then there is the outer world. So the world as it appears to this person when he looks at the world from his own position, and what his mind gives him, and then the world that appears to others around him about himself. So he's also a very open poet in that sense, and self-critical, because he's aware that there are two dimensions to his own self. One, that he thinks of himself to be the kind of person he thinks he is, and the other is regarding what others think about him. So I think as a poet, he's also a self-conscious, self-critical poet, and is open and aware of the various dimensions that exist in the persona of the poet. So I think this is something that he's also trying to, in his autobiography World Within World, he's not talking so much about himself. He's actually talking about the other, as an autobiographer, he's actually talking about other writers around him. In this book, the section on his childhood, for instance, figures at the end, because he thinks that he wanted to keep the personal at the end, the very personal at the end, and he begins with talking about the lives of T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, Virginia Woolf. These are the kind of writers he's evoking in this autobiography. So I think this has a lot to say about the kind of prioritizations that he had. He tried to privilege the environment, the political events and the social events of the time, and try to build it in a kind of an autobiographical form, the atmosphere of the time. I think this is what he was really trying to evoke, by bringing in the writers of the time, the literary, or you could call it a literary autobiography, because you can see literary allusions to W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot and others in his works. So Auden, in that sense, tried to experiment with literary form as well. But again, he is also, these poets are of course called Auden poets, but they are also called Pylon poets, often referred to as Oxford poets, Auden group poets, or Pylon poets. Now, why they are called Pylon poets is because they refer to the technical advancements and industrial advancements at the time. They try to bring in this concrete industrial images in their poetry. So Spender, while he has a lot of influence of Wordsworth, and there is, I'd say, a lot of natural imagery that is also, I don't know if you can say, marred by or juxtaposed by the other kind of images of the 1930s that become pronounced in the writing of these poets, which is to project these industrial images. Now, think of his poems such as The Express. Right. Now, The Express, he is talking about the train, and he uses the image of the piston, the piston for the train engine, and he is talking about the engine and how the engine is working as the train is taking its course. And in the poem, look at the what he says, and I quote, he says that the black statement of pistons, without more fuss but gliding like a queen, she leaves the station. Right. So, he is referring to this, the train's movement, but at the same time he talks about, so he is talking about, he is bringing in these images, the piston, the concrete, the tar and other things. Then he also goes on to talk about the darker image. He says, and I quote, the song of her whistle screaming at curves of deafening tunnels breaks innumerable bolts, unquote. So, there are bolts and there are breaks and there are tunnels that have been created, that have been produced in this venture, but there are these whistles that are screaming and the deafening tunnels. So, the process of industrialization and the effect of industrialization, I'd say, is also captured in the poetry of the 1930s by these poets who are often referred to as Pylon poets as well as Oxford poets, progressive poets of the 1930s. I find it also very interesting that 1930s is the decade in India when the progressive writers come to the fore. So, whatever is taking shape in 1930s in London, in England, has also the influence of progressive writers. Remember Ahmad Ali and others, they actually begin, the Progressive Writers Association is actually formed in London. So, I think it's got to do a lot, the impact of the progressive, Auden group poets or the pink poets on progressive poets in India, and I can see a direct connection there, how their works would have influenced the writing of the progressive period in India, just to draw that parallel, what's happening in India and in London. So this is how I'd like to introduce Spender with these different influences that are working at the same time on his life. Something maybe about his life that I've already told you, that the earlier instance where they had to relocate to the Lake District, but and the influence of Wordsworth at the time. Spender actually published his first collection of poetry as early as in 1930. When he was only 21 years old, and and T.S. Eliot promoted his work as well and published him in Faber and Faber. So so there is this kind of this early poet, this kind of first flush of youth, but also at the same time first brush with politics, I'd say, during the 1930s, and he goes on to publish poems, another collection in 1933, and he publishes several collections then in the following decades, for instance the Still Centre in 1939, and then the Dedication in 1946, till in fact the 1990s, just a year before his death, when he published Dolphins in 1994. So the period that we are looking at is from 1905 to 1995, good the entire century itself, and how his views also developing in this century, and his brush with different movements, different writers. He was in touch with W.H. Auden, W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot, how his own personality was shaping and shifting, his own brush with socialism during this period, and how he projected it in his works. We must also remember that poets, all these poets use literature as the site to register their discontent at the time, and they believed that writers had to remain in touch with the political and social issues of the period. Also noting that Spender's mother was of the Jewish German descent. Yeah. So the period of the 1930s with its cult of Nazism actually affected him personally, and he was a strong opponent of it, and he went as he was also working for the Daily Worker, the magazine, the left magazine, during World War II, and he went to Spain also before that in 1937 to see what was the problems that people were facing and Soviet influence during the war. So he was sent as a correspondent. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of exposure of the political of the political scene that is at hand, and he joins World War II. He's there in Spain in 1937, and with his knowledge of German, he actually also translated Bertolt Brecht in 1938. So the 1930s is a period which is very politically charged. This is what I mean to say, including 1940s when you would be taken to the war. So, and Spender is in the thick of things. He's reacting to things. He's a part of the London fire services in World War II. So all these external happenings, they seem to impinge on the life of the individual and how he registers them in his works. I think this is something that one needs to look at when we are looking at Spender, when he's in the throes of things, and then how he tries to capture them in his poetry. And this is what makes his poetry, some of the themes in his poems that you would find, therefore, would be, on one hand you will find there are instances of childhood, love, friendship, but on the other hand you would see ideological kind of poetry, politics, the influence of the war periods, the First World War, the Spanish Civil War. You'd see as a result you would see there will be a tragic despair, the images of industry, right? But then you'd also see that there is an image which is captured in movement, in the act, and the narrative gets created when he captures this image in movement. The other kind of poetry that Spender is really known for is a kind of a very dialectical poetry, which is where the dialectics of emotion and the dialectics of the states of mind is presented. One instance of it is, of course, what we discussed, the outer and the inner worlds of the poet, the inner and the outer, or the subjective and the objective, how they are constantly reactive, and they are mutually, in that sense, they are not mutually exclusive, I'd say. So in a way there is a dialectic that is also available in his poems, and that I think is the essence of Spender's creative process. For him, he often noted that a turn of phrase would trigger a memory in his mind, and poems for him were then very much a connection between the past, and that is in the form of the memory, and the present. So there is dialectic of the inner and the outer self, but there is also the dialectic which is operating of the past and the present, which keeps, there is a kind of a back and forth movement. So he uses this through dreams, etc. And in fact, he notes in his foreword to the collection, that which is the Still Center, published in 1939, he noted, and I quote, that poetry does not state truth. It states the condition within which something felt is true. Well, how do you react to that? That poetry does not state truth, it states the conditions within which something felt is true.
No, your explanation about the emotions and the mental states, as you call them, of Stephen Spender, they are quite lucid, and they appeal a lot to the Indian reader and to the European reader also. And I would suggest, in passing, that if he is writing about his own times with major writers of the time, then I think it would be better for our students of literature to read his works, in order to understand the nature and the temperament of the entire 20th century. And you also find a connection between him and the Indian progressive movement. So that is further meaningful to understand these different things as reflective of what you call the dialectical reality of the time. So friends, this kind of introduction actually has in mind some of the poems that she will be discussing in the second part of the lecture. And I think they will definitely enlighten the atmosphere of the poems that she will pick up in order to explain these certain things, that appeal to us even today. He was there till the end of the 20th century, and he in fact that way went over the entire century, in its fullness, in its fulfillment, all those things. And I think it would be really profitable to contend with the ideas that he projected in his poetry.